Hello everyone and welcome to Jack's Arcade. And since this is my first video on this channel, it only makes sense to talk about one of the very first video games that I ever played back when I was just 8 years old, and that I would play for many years to come, and that is the original 1992 Mortal Kombat. And today we'll be talking about specifics like gameplay, graphics, reception, controversy, and more. So sit back, relax, and let's get into this legend of gaming that is Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat! So when Mortal Kombat released back in 1992, it's a very safe bet to say that nobody, including the developers and creators themselves, anticipated the kind of reception that it would get from the fans that would cause many sequels to be created to this very day. And after over 30 years, we have a total of 12 games in the franchise, if you do not count certain titles such as Mortal Kombat Mythology Sub-Zero, Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks, which was great by the way, and Mortal Kombat Special Forces, which was not so great by the way. The first thing that most, including myself, would remember about Mortal Kombat was the visuals. Now back then, the digitized characters that were modeled after real people was awesome and made everything look realistic, and even though the game itself was a bit rough in certain aspects, the blood was a standout feature that enhanced the realistic look of the game that actually complemented it very well. And characters were quite familiar in ways that got the player interested in them just by the way they looked. You had Liu Kang, who is basically Bruce Lee. You had Scorpion, the yellow ninja with a cool spear move. You had Sub-Zero, the blue ninja that could freeze you. Raiden, a thunder god wielding the powers of lightning. Kano, who somewhat resembled the Terminator. Johnny Cage, the Hollywood actor, who somewhat resembled Jean-Claude Van Damme, particularly with his tight black shorts and spandex with the red sash. And Sonya, who resembled a female gymnast with a military background. And according to co-creator Ed Boon, Sonya and Kano were actually the least used characters in the game, which was why they were not brought back from Mortal Kombat 2. But every character, popular or not, had their own special moves and unique finishers, but more on that later. There were 3 additional characters in which the player could not control, but can fight against if you either knew how or where, or were good enough to make it to the final 2 characters. Reptile, a green ninja who had both Scorpion and Sub-Zero special moves, had moved way faster than any other characters in the game. This made him very, very difficult to beat, and he would appear suddenly and randomly before a match would start, leaving clues to the players of how they could find him. And the way to find him is to perform a double flawless victory and a fatality on the pit stage. Then you would face him on the pit bottom, which was the only way you could access that stage as well. Then we had a sub-boss as well as the main boss for the main antagonist for the game. The sub-boss was Goro, an 8-foot-tall Shokan warrior who was described as a half-human, half-dragon being with 4 arms and the largest character on screen in the entire game. Then there was Shang Tsung, the sorcerer with the ability to shoot up to 3 fireballs from his hands and shapeshift into any character in the game besides Reptile. The stages or backgrounds in the game were also unique because they had this fantasy reality feeling to them. They looked like places that actually existed, but at the same time they looked like something out of this world. We had Goro's lair, which had a dark background with glowing eyes in the shadows, making the player think of what was back there, along with a skeleton in the middle. The palace gates would remind players of those old school Chinese martial arts films. Shang Tsung's courtyard, which would again remind you of those old school martial arts films once more, which by the way was actually part of the inspiration for the game. Shang Tsung's throne room, which was complete with its red carpet and golden dragon decor as well as his throne. The pit, which was not so wide of a bridge in which the losing opponent could be uppercutted down onto a bed of spikes with the night sky and clouds and the moon visible in the background. And then we had the Warrior Shrine, which was a stage consisting of statues of all the characters in the game in the background, except for Reptile and Shang Tsung. And personally, I must say that I'm glad that they actually had a couple of night stages in the game, which fit into the game's tone incredibly well. Now, while some people categorize Fatalities as a gameplay feature, I respectfully look at it as a visual feature, especially since the match is already over by the time you can attempt one. Fatalities are signature finishing moves for each character, and each character has one of their own, which was another reason to pick a specific character that you would not pick to play as otherwise. Scorpion takes off his mask, displaying his skull, and breathes fire on you, incinerating you into a skeleton. Liu Kang does a fancy scissor kick on you, and then following with a very strong uppercut, sending you high off screen before you can land again. Raiden uses his lightning abilities to knock your head clean off. Johnny Cage uppercuts your head clean off. Sonya blows an incinerating kiss at you from a distance, turning you into a skeleton, and Sub-Zero rips out your head and spinal cord attached, Predator style, and Kano rips out your heart. Fatalities were a big mystery back then, and nobody knew how to perform one, and there were rumors that someone would see them and people would actually not believe what they would hear because it just sounded too ridiculous. But back then, the way I found out how to do a fatality, besides the first time one was done to me, and more on that later, was through magazines like GamePro, to name one. But back then, knowing how to perform a fatality was like having a superpower, and if you performed one in front of a crowd who had never seen one before, man was that a treat. Now, although visuals were an important part of the game, let's get into the gameplay. Oh, and by the way, as far as fatalities are concerned, the way I figured out how to do one was the fact that I was shown by the opponent that beat me, and then Johnny Cage became my main character, and then after that, I found a GamePro magazine, figured out how to do the rest, and the rest was history. So let's get into the gameplay. So, compared to a game of that era such as Street Fighter II, Mortal Kombat did not play as smoothly, or was it a technical fighting game as well? It was not. Some people totally would say that Mortal Kombat was more of a tech demo, especially when you compare it to the sequel and the games that would follow. But a lot of what would be in the sequels would begin their foundation here in the original. All characters had the same basic moves, such as a high punch, a low punch, a high kick, a low kick, and there was also a dedicated block button. But by combining inputs on the joystick along with these basic buttons and moves, would allow for other moves such as a sweep, a roundhouse kick, a low punch, a block, if you got in close enough for a throw as well, which would work very well against defensive players who love to block a bit too much. And of course, the devastating uppercut itself. Now, this move in particular was the basic move to go for, because not only did it send your opponent flying way high into the air, but it would also by far take the most health away from your opponent. And this was the reason why people would use the uppercut, following a special move which would likely set you up for an uppercut, and this move would be a move that would be used very often by pretty much everybody for this reason. And every character had their own special moves that would make them unique in character and in gameplay as well. Sub-Zero, for instance, would send an ice ball your way, freezing you in place for around 3 seconds, as well as a slide that would be swift and quick for a low attack. Scorpion would throw a spear, impaling you and pulling you in for a free hit, which was usually an uppercut, along with a teleport punch that would catch opponents off guard from behind. Liu Kang would perform a flying kick, Bruce Lee style, that could cover a good distance, as well as throw a fire projectile at you. Kano would throw a machete at you, as well as make himself into a human cannonball that could catch you from across the screen if you were not careful. Sonya could throw pink rings from her wrists, as well as catch you with her legs in scissors-like fashion and slam you to the ground behind her. Raiden can throw a lightning spark at you, as well as fly across the screen and push you against the far side of the screen, as well as the third special move that allows him to teleport for positioning, but does not do damage by itself. And finally, Johnny Cage throws his own projectile, as well as a shadow kick that looks flashy, and a split punch right to the groin. And Cage is actually the only character with all three of his signature special moves that do damage. Plus, the split groin punch was likely another Jean-Claude Van Damme nod. Characters can also jump punch and jump kick, as well as block, being its own unique dedicated button as mentioned earlier. And because most fighting games back in the day then required the player to actually simply just hold back on the joystick, which was on the opposite direction of their opponent, to block. So this was very unique, and every character, as mentioned before, could throw, which was great against defensive opponents that really loved to hold block all the time. But chip damage was always a thing, so if somebody was blocking and you hit them, you would still do some chip damage. Combos would be tricky to perform in the game, usually requiring a standard basic move along with special moves in order to do a 2-hit combo, in which players had to be creative in order to successfully land one that did not include catching someone with a free hit special move followed by an uppercut, for instance. Most players would use that formula, but advanced players would actually use every possible combination, such as a jump kick followed by a slide using Sub-Zero, for instance. Once the player picks a fighter of their choice, you would then be taken to the battle plan, in which the player had to face every single player in the game one-on-one, including a clone of the character that they picked, in which back then was called the mirror match. Then players would have to go through 3 separate endurance matches, which the player had to face 2 opponents, one after the other in the same round, which in my opinion was the toughest part of the game. And then the player would face off against the sub-boss Goro, and finally the player would then face Shang Tsung. The original Mortal Kombat today would be described as a tech demo by a lot of the people, rightfully so, because when compared to its sequel, which would release the following year, it was very obvious that the original Mortal Kombat was as such in every aspect, especially when you compare it to its fellow fighting games of that time. But the game's tone and the game's unique visual features would attract and gain popularity among many gamers, regardless, in which the developers would start working on a sequel almost immediately. So with that being said, Mortal Kombat itself was actually still a complete game. You had your characters, you had your special moves per characters, you had your basic moves, you had your finishers and things like that. There were stages, there was even a secret. So everything that you needed in terms of your meat and potatoes of a fighting game would still be present in Mortal Kombat of 1992, despite the fact that we look at it today as a tech demo, and who knows, maybe even back then it was meant to be a tech demo in terms of, hey, this is what we got, do you guys like this or not? And thankfully, people did. Now let's talk about the story and lore. Although the story and lore has evolved and slightly changed since its original game, it did have the foundation of the story that would be built from here and growing among its sequels to the point to where there would eventually be a movie made from the story as well as other media. But before a player would press start, besides the common title screen that we would see in pretty much every game in arcade back then, every character had their own brief intro that told you a bit about them as well as the story of the game itself to a degree that would at least get a player interested, and this was at a time when story in any given game was certainly not as impactful as it is today, especially with Mortal Kombat, as MK actually became the first fighting game franchise to introduce a real legit story mode for a fighting game, starting with Mortal Kombat vs. DC Universe. And in today's Mortal Kombat games, it is still very much a standout and very comparable to full-on feature-length movies that can release in theaters and in that kind of quality and storytelling and more. But obviously things didn't start out like that. So let's talk about each individual story intros for every character in the original Mortal Kombat. Johnny Cage is labeled as a martial arts superstar trained by great masters from around the world, and he uses his talents on the big screen box office to champ and star in such movies as Dragon Fist and Dragon Fist 2, as well as the award-winning Sudden Violence. Kano is labeled as a mercenary thug extortionist thief that lives a life of crime and injustice. He is a devoted member of the Black Dragon, which is a dangerous group of cut-throated madmen feared and respected throughout crime's inner circles. Raiden is labeled as, the name Raiden is actually the deity known as the Thunder God. So it is rumored that he has received a personal invitation by Shang Tsung himself and took the form of a human to compete in the tournament. Liu Kang is labeled as a member of the super sacred White Lotus Society. Liu Kang left the organization in order to represent the Shaolin temples in the tournament. Kang is strong in his beliefs and despises Shang Tsung. Scorpion is labeled as, like Sub-Zero, Scorpion's true name and origin are not known. He has shown from time to time to distrust and have a hatred towards Sub-Zero. Between ninjas, member of the top United States Special Forces unit, and her team was hot on the trail of Kano's Black Dragon organization, and they followed them to an uncharted island in which they were ambushed by Shang Tsung's personal army. Now every character had their own endings as well. So Johnny Cage basically makes a successful Mortal Kombat movie and has many successful sequels after it. Kano's Black Dragon organization forms a monopoly over the tournament. Raiden wins the tournament easily and gets bored and invites other gods to the tournament, in which the end result is basically the end of the world. Liu Kang restores the tournament to its traditional roots. Scorpion was murdered by Sub-Zero and was allowed to come back from the dead to avenge his death, and having won the tournament, he can never go back to his wife and child that he left behind. Sub-Zero was only in the tournament to kill Shang Tsung and was offered a lot of money to do so, and basically retires from his profession after gaining all that fortune. Sonya's team would be released from capture by Shang Tsung if she could win the tournament, And she did, but also put an end to Kano's Black Dragon in the process, as well as Shang Tsung's grip on the tournament. And obviously Liu Kang's ending would be the true ending of the game, as the beginning of the sequel in Mortal Kombat 2 would show, and every game following the original Mortal Kombat in the arcade ladder mode leaves the player wondering, basically wondering what the game's real ending is, and they will not find out until the next game's sequel, actually. Recent games have had their own story mode, obviously, and that still kind of leaves fans wondering in terms of what would happen next. But the arcade ladder mode still has character-specific endings that again leave the players wondering what will become of their favorite character in the storyline when the sequel comes around. And now with multiple timelines, and even though we follow one specific one in the new Mortal Kombat 1 that is just released, the multiple timelines makes things very interesting, and so far Mortal Kombat has managed to walk that fine line very well. So let's get into the next topic of this game, controversy. So when it comes to attracting players, players received the game very well and were having lots of fun playing the game and would be wowed by its realistic visuals and the blood and the gore. And unfortunately, the very thing that made the game great among fans would be the very thing that would bring the game some unwanted attention and would be all over the news. Mortal Kombat would be the first game to raise the question of, do violent games actually cause violence? Although it would take quite some time to get the answer to this question, there was a compromise at that time, and that still holds well to this day. Mortal Kombat would be responsible for the rating system in video games that still exists to this very day. Co-creator Ed Boon had stated that at the time there were other video games out there that actually were more violent than Mortal Kombat, but Mortal Kombat just so happened to be the most popular and successful violent video game at the time, making it the target for news and stories. And back then it was a big deal because video games were still, believe it or not, in their infancy, especially when you compare them to today, and people of all walks of life simply were not familiar with games like they are today, whether they play them or not. Mortal Kombat also has quite a few impressive accolades under its belt as well, including more recent accolades all of these years later. So let's start in 1996. In 1996, Games Radar listed Mortal Kombat at number 1 of its top 100 games of all time list. In 1995, Flux magazine had it at number 5 of its top 100 video games list. In 2012, Time named it one of the 100 greatest games of all time. In 2013, it was named the best arcade game in the 90s by Complex. And in 2019, the Strong National Museum of Play inducted Mortal Kombat into its World Video Game Hall of Fame. So in conclusion, the best way to truly know and understand how great the original Mortal Kombat game really was, you just had to be there when everything happened, and thankfully, at the age of 8 and beyond, I was. And I watched the franchise grow into the amazing franchise that it is today, and literally watched it create this kind of gaming culture within itself that really took a lot of people by storm, basically. For gamers of today who were not around back then to experience this phenomenon firsthand, the best thing that I could say is that there is a reason why Mortal Kombat has lasted for over 30 plus years, and it's actually not holding on by a mere thread today either. And just to be a little bit more specific about the success of some of the more recent Mortal Kombat games, here are some historic facts. Mortal Kombat 9, which came out in 2011, sold 3 million units. Mortal Kombat X, also known as Mortal Kombat 10, which released in 2015, sold over 12 million units. And Mortal Kombat 11, which released in 2019, has sold over 15 million units. And judging by its reception so far, the new Mortal Kombat 1 was released in early access for those who bought the premium edition as of this recording. It's actually being praised quite well so far, and it is likely that the game will be a financial success and popular among the fans once again. Very few games actually manage to have this level of impact and success after so many years and so many sequels and all sorts of media that have been created over the years. And that, my friends, is one of the many reasons as to why Mortal Kombat will always be a legend among all fighting games. So with that being said, I want to know what you think down below. What do you think of when you think Mortal Kombat? Where were you when this phenomenon of a fighting game came out of nowhere? And even if you weren't there, what do you think of Mortal Kombat these days when it comes to mind? Or what was the first Mortal Kombat game that caught your attention? And thank you all so very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the next gaming adventure right here at Jack's Arcade.